December 21st is our story for today. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Wanted to also thank our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the show, please take time to like and subscribe. And for those of you who are who enjoy the show, want to learn more, we do have some trade consulting in terms of assisting you in portfolio management thought process as we head into this huge time for Tesla. Just drop us a note at our Patreon or a private message at Teslafaninsight on Facebook. So the last couple of days have been rather interesting for us because there's actually an article in CNBC that came out, and it referenced an executive, I believe Mr. Greenblatt, who works for S&P. And he threw out some very interesting data points that I was kind of stunned by, and I could see now why the S&P has been having a lot of challenges with how to deal with Tesla. In particular, he pointed out something very interesting, a couple of data points that I've spent, hours thinking about, but and then I've called some people on Wall Street to find out their thoughts, and there's a whole bunch of perspectives, and they don't all sort of come together, even though there's some very basic math that's associated. So let's go through this. So the data point that I was particularly focused on for Mr. Bloomberg's CNBC discussion is the fact that 17% of the S&P are index funds. So what an index fund is that there are these covenants or documents that are written defining what a fund is supposed to do. In this case, what this fund does is they have a very strict rule about ownership of certain stocks, in this case, the S&P 500 shares or stocks, and they specifically have to stay very locked in on certain numbers. Now, why, how, et cetera. So it's almost a computer-based issue relative to the purchase of shares and putting them in these indices, and they have to be very strict about maintaining the agreement and not breaching it, if you will. So a number that Mr. Greenblatt threw out was the fact that there's actually 17% of the S&P are these indices or index funds. And what they further pointed out is of those, because of Tesla's current market cap, Tesla equals 1.5% of the S&P. The further number that he threw out was that 1.5% of the S&P represents $80 billion worth of Tesla stock that must be purchased by those indices at the best price they can get between Friday and the open on Monday. So there'll be after hours trading, et cetera. So what's interesting about this situation is that I actually thought that the purchase would be spread out of time, over time, to execute this. It turns out that the non-17% of the sort of S&P, if they're not indices, had the option of doing purchases prior to this time. So therefore, we're in an interesting zone where have all of the purchases by the other S&P entities been completed? You could argue the answer is either no, so they've got to buy their shares as well, or the answer could be absolutely, they've already purchased it, which would push the, so the number is either zero or it could be 100%. Let's assume that, let's say 70% or 80% of those stocks have been purchased by the remainder of the S&P. Well, this is an interesting problem because if only 20% of those folks who are purchased right now that are sort of affiliated S&P entities. They are S&P just the technology. They're S&P plus or minus certain entities that aren't growing very quickly. There are all these entities that have their covenants as well that are required to do purchases. So one could argue then that 1.5% of the shares have to be purchased by the S&P entities. But then in theory, perhaps another 0.5%, possibly 1% of the shares have to be purchased by all these other entities that are part of the S&P sort of family. So which therefore means that, let's say the real purchase of the shares is about 2%, possibly 3%. So that kind of doubles the dollar value of shares needed to be purchased. And in theory, that's $160 billion worth of shares, which in theory is about a third of the shares that are out there for, to be purchased by Tesla. Or they're anyway, you get the idea. These guys have to buy a lot of stock, and $160 billion for a company that's, let's say, 5 to 600 billion, that's a third of the outstanding shares that need to be purchased. So what this then means is that there's a problem that popped up the S&P found, which is usually the process that they do to execute bringing new companies in, like Tesla, is to simply announce these companies are in, and then 1 week later this is completed and everything's fine. The problem that pops up is what happens when you have a company like Tesla with several constraints to how this process should work. Number one constraint is founder owns with his buddies 25% of the company. Number two, large institutions already own the shares, and in theory, the free component of, we've done the math in the past, 60% of the shares are controlled by institutions, 25% Elon and affiliated individuals and entities. So that's 85% of shares. So the float is only 15% of the shares remaining in theory. So this presents an interesting problem, because what if all the S&P entities need about 30% of the shares in order to complete their purchases? And so this is where things have been challenging. Even the S&P didn't know how to deal with this and was surveying money managers and other participants on how to bring Tesla in. Should they bring it in two sections? Should they bring it all at once? It was an unknown. The all at once plan that they've now chosen creates a very interesting problem, because what it does is it forces prices up on a supply-demand basis dramatically all at one time. So hence the title of the show, which is Tesla up 300 points in one day. So this is what's interesting now. What's interesting about this is, I found, is that, wait a second, there are people who have discretionary opportunities to buy and sell shares, like hedge funds, like individuals, and that's fine. There are also indices that have Tesla shares, and we don't know the percentage of those, but they're required to own the shares regardless of the price. Not only are they required to own the shares, but there are other indices that are required to purchase the shares regardless of the price. So this is where the whole thing gets really interesting, because all of a sudden the price could keep rising, and these indices would be compelled to keep buying until they achieved the allocation numbers that are appropriate. So this is why the S&P ended up surveying a large number of managers. They were considering many options of how to deal with this. And they did get Elon to issue, I guess, 10 billion shares, so that the number of shares available to be sold or bought or sold had expanded. And so this was, the goal of all this was to try to reduce the potential for chaos. Because what do I mean by chaos? Well, as these entities try to get their shares, it could be up 100 points before you acquire enough shares that you need. What if the stock price doubles when this happens? before you have sufficient shares handed over. Those are definitely on the table. And so this is going to be one of the wildest, strangest situations to ever occur, I believe, in the stock market, where you could have a company that's already 600 billion become 1.2 trillion in order to accommodate all the potential buyers out there. And so this is going to be a barn burner. So there are other numbers that were kind of thrown around, but these specific numbers, I think, illustrate that we're about to see something historic and historically profitable for those who are in and are long-term shareholders and like the company. And then let's not even discuss the raft of questions. So the big thing that's been going on is, in sort of my research, is contacting different Wall Street executives and trying to figure out what's going to happen. For the last 3 weeks or so, a big discussion is the after S&P trade. So in theory, what's going to happen is that the stock price of Tesla is going to spike to a very high number. Once it gets to that high number, you're going to have, theoretically, all the buyers will finally have their shares that they need as part of the indices. And so in theory, there'll be a very small amount of float left. And so what's then going to happen? And the answer that a lot of smart investment folks have come up with is that the stock price is actually going to fall. And the reason it's going to fall is that the demand has been satiated, number one, but number two, the gap between what that price ends up being and the fundamentals of the company might be. So all the earnings multiple, what is Tesla's growth rate, all that information will eventually start weighing on the stock to come into range of something that somewhat mirrors how fast the company is growing, maybe multiple of sales, et cetera, in order to figure all this out. Currently, the answer is nobody really knows how this is all going to work out. But the suggestion is that the stock price will go dramatically up in a 24-hour period, and then crest, and then at the other end of that, it's going to drop dramatically. And the drop is a reflection of the fact that everybody's got their shares now, and we're sitting in this very lofty position. This introduces some very interesting questions, and the most important question I think that's introduced here is, what if we have a situation where, because of the indices buying, and because the institutional ownership, and because Elon's not selling any of his shares, and because Tesla's not issuing any new shares, we have the stock completely oversubscribed, meaning that there are all these entities that now own shares. They've purchased them at high prices from individuals. And in theory, they should be saying, oh, we just made a bunch of money, let's just sell. And that selling pressure would actually reduce the stock price. That, in theory, should be what occurs. There's an idea that I wanted to present that I think lurks. And what that idea is, what if the indices that are required to have Tesla as part of their allocation end up sitting there and saying, hey, we can't sell shares because we're required to own them as a percentage of S&P ownership. And so if they hold on to the shares like they're supposed to, there's no float out there. There's cause for the stock price to stay up where it's at until somebody figures out, like Elon issued more shares, until somebody figures out how to get those people to start trading their shares, in which case the stock price would fall. So there's way more questions in the show than there are answers. And there are logical answers that you could give relative to the usual of how things work. And the issue right now is the usual really isn't happening. So the question is kind of, what do you do with this, given that you can't operate off of what the usual might be? So I kind of bring all this up to you because what I think is going to happen is, for those who own the shares, they're going to do extremely well here and be very, very happy. For those who don't own them, they're not very happy. When the meeting occurred that was called by the S&P, as well as the questions that were posed to try to figure this out, I just thought it was interesting to note that the number one focus was that from a supply and demand standpoint, it was very clear to the S&P that the stock price was going to spike and it was going to cost the index managers slash their shareholders a lot of money. And they were trying to figure out how to mitigate this. And no conclusion or answer was arrived at because what they were thinking about doing to solve this would have damaged one side or the other. So if you lower the net cost to the index managers of this whole thing, you end up damaging the people who already own the stock because you're hampering their ability to make money. So you get immediately sued. Um, Asking Elon to issue more shares, which is what he did, is something you can do that's legal, that makes sense. So that was okay. But do not be surprised if something crazy happens like Tesla 100 up or Tesla stock price doubles in a 24, 48-hour period. But we don't know how long this is going to last. We just know it's going to be a very big number for a certain period of time because of the supply demand constraints that are going on here. So I wanted to throw out some of the general issues that are popping up, and we really look forward to your input on your thoughts on how this is going to work. I think it's going to be fun to see how our section works. Just a reminder, if you do choose to comment, constructive comments only, we do delete, we do block people who make really horrible negative comments, and it's really not appreciated. And I encourage you to find another channel to be mean on, but you don't have to do it on my channel because there are plenty of other places you can be mean and get blocked rather than on my channel. Any rate, we want to thank you for taking time out to review this with us. We'll continue to dig for data in terms of better how to manage this and share that with you because I think this is a huge opportunity for a lot of people to make a lot of money who've been in Tesla for a long time. The one fly in the ointment I'd encourage you to consider is some puts. So if you own stock and it just doubled in value, you have 100% return or 50% return. If you own options, whatever, think about picking up some puts as a way to hedge the gain that you have, because I think that at some point you could end up with a huge downdraft and you end up losing most of what you just gained as this crazy crescendo occurs. I'm very much looking forward to folks that have another analysis to this that I do not, but I do think that we're entering a very amazing period where there's an opportunity to make a lot of money in a short period of time. And even the pros didn't have an idea of how to sort of mitigate what's going to occur here. At any rate, this is the end of our formal Tesla discussion. Just a reminder on our usual health tips. I wanted to note that I went to Stanford University, and we, as part of being a student there, just after graduation, I had a chance to work at something called the Stanford Sleep Clinic for about 1 year. And during that period, I ended up getting an opportunity to work with Dr. William Dement. So if you've heard of something called REM, rapid eye movement, Dr. Dement literally sat next to a patient in the bed, and he recorded what their eyes did over their sleeping patterns. And that's how he came up with REM as part of good sleep. So I'm not a doctor, I don't claim to be, but I do want to encourage you to read up on something called circadian rhythms. So the core idea from a sleep standpoint is that if you put your body in a pattern of wake and sleep where you don't have to use an alarm clock on a regular basis, that maintaining that same rhythm 24 hours a day for at least a couple of weeks will put you in a rhythm so that as you sleep and wake, you'll be very comfortable. You'll start to notice that you're productive or want to eat at certain times. So that circadian rhythm and synchronizing with it gives you a better quality of life. What was suggested by one of Dr. Dement's grad students when I asked him about it, he said, look, if people really want to be happy in their lives, try to find a career path or work that synchronizes with your sleep-wake patterns, because if you do, you get an optimization of life that other people don't get. And so something to consider, in terms of our health tips for the week read up on circadian rhythms, and try to go to bed and wake up at the same time for a couple of weeks. Also wanted to encourage you, if you live alone, to get a sleep app because part of the training that we got was looking at people that have sleep apnea. And so if you get it downloaded on your phone from either Droid or from Apple, this will allow you to gather data on yourself over your sleep night. And if you hear that you have sleep apnea, you kind of stop breathing at certain points because of it. You may want to get that data loaded up with your doc to review where you are, because there may be things you could do to mitigate the potential impact negatively on your body, like you dying in your sleep, for example. So, any rate, this is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Um, Čist German, au revoir, French, Lehithro, Hebrew, Choda Hafez, Farsi, Zdravstvuyte, Russian, Ni hao ma, Chinese, Ohio gozaimasu, Japanese, Heido, Swedish, Namaste, Hindi, and do widzenia, Polish, Mahalo, our friends in Hawaii. And in Jamaica, we say, Nuff respect, walk good man. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day. Look forward to your comments.